Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 50, the second episode of the new year and here in 2022. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Cheatham. Kyler, welcome back as always.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This is your podcast for everything related to digital transformation, the people, process, technology, and strategy components of transformation. You can find new episodes every Wednesday on YouTube, LinkedIn, as well as all the audio podcast platforms like Spotify, Google, Amazon, etc. And today we've got an exciting episode. We're going to cover three major segments. The first one is getting into some topics that we haven't covered in this podcast in the past, and that is financial technology, or fintech, as people often refer to it as. We're going to talk about, in our first segment, just some general fintech hot topics and trends that, Kyler, you're seeing in the marketplace. And later in the show, we're going to have a guest, Dan Maurice, who's a vice president at PNC Bank, which is a financial services organization, and he's going to be on talking in more detail about fintech and financial transformation. So that's going to be kind of the theme here of the first two segments is focused on fintech and financial transformations. And then later in the show, we'll have Nate Strower, who's a director at Third Stage Consulting. He'll be on the show with Kyler and I talking about resistance to change and some client case studies surrounding resistance to change and what some of the things are that we've seen clients do to be successful in overcoming that resistance. So exciting show for you today. So we're excited to have those conversations here today. But before we jump in and bring on our first guest, Kyler, what are some of the things you're seeing in the whole world of fintech, or maybe we should back up and just talk about what is fintech or financial technology? Do you have an answer for us on that front before we jump in?
Yeah. So when we talk about fintech, we're talking about technology or digital evolution and transformations when it comes to financially based businesses or customer experiences. It's something that I've learned about that I think is fascinating. We kind of see, I think that we see the banking or financial industry much how we see like telecommunications, really hard, really kind of these are the rules and our customers need to follow them. And as we've seen this evolution of the term even unbanked, right? Customers that aren't actually using traditional banking services and more technology-based applications to manage their finances, whether it's actually housing their assets there or budgeting or sharing of transactions with friends, like something like Venmo, or PayPal, which we know a lot about. So the first thing I wanted to start with today, Eric, was just sharing four of these trends that we're seeing in the industry. And I wanted to kind of get your reaction to them, specifically when it comes to cloud technology, because I know that's something that you always kind of help us level set and just know that evolution into the cloud, though it's a great progress, it needs to be taken with the overall requirements and needs of the business. So when we talk about these trends, we've seen big banks such as Capital One, which has moved to Amazon Web Services, and PayPal, which is migrating to the Google Cloud platform. And an Accenture report actually forecasts that this will grow 15% per year, just because of the COVID-19 pandemic and just the overall evolution of technology. A lot of consumers cite things like scalability, resilience, flexibility, access to kind of more of a public cloud is more attractive to customers. So I wondered if you could kind of give us your reaction to moving something as sensitive as financial information into these bigger cloud hosting services.
Yeah, I thought maybe where you're headed with this, and maybe you're baiting me into bringing it up again. But in past episodes, late last year in 2021, we had a couple episodes where we talked about the AWS outages and disruptions to the public cloud. And I think this is, I hate to go back to that again for a third or fourth episode in a row, but I kind of have to, given the nature of the question. But you do have to think about the reliability of some of these bigger cloud providers, not just AWS, but any cloud provider. And, there's certainly benefit, but there's also risk to that as well. So on one hand, you have COVID or the pandemic that sort of pushed or accelerated this movement to the cloud for a lot of software providers. But on the other hand, COVID and the pandemic has also seen an increase in cybersecurity breaches and cloud reliability issues. And it could be the strains that are being put on cloud now that there's an accelerated movement toward that. But regardless of the root cause, I think that's something that people need to be aware of. It's one thing if Netflix is down for a couple hours. It's another thing if you just can't access your money for a couple hours. That's probably a bigger deal, I would argue, on the latter side. So
Absolutely.
that's my knee jerk reaction to it is just what do you do and
Yeah.
what's the backup and is that really the best answer? Do you want to put everything in the cloud or what's the fallback if all else fails?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting time to be having this conversation about fintech or financial technology because we have some people that are really worried about the economy that are burying silver and gold bricks in their backyard, right? And then we have the evolution of these banking systems that are really becoming more flexible for and scalable for their customer base. So it's kind of a really big polarity between what a consumer wants in that security. And then, kind of speaking of that security piece and the emerging technologies, another trend that they've been seeing is that banks are utilizing those AI features for things like customer information verification, cash management, financial statement reporting, and then those can reduce costs, specifically on the consumer for those fees by about 75%. So that seems like more of a positive when it comes to talking about financial technologies within kind of the digital transformation or evolution
Right.
space.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it is, and it is fascinating how we're seeing both sides of this here play out. Where on one hand there's opportunity, it's cool new stuff, but on the other hand there's risk. It's change, which is always hard for all of us. There's technical risk and exposure, all that good stuff, and a lot of what you're talking about too. By the way, I know you're talking a lot about financial institutions and their use of fintech, but actually fintech is something that also applies to or can apply to most organizations and their finance functions within non-financial services types of organizations too. So it's something that's really permeating throughout the consumer world as well as the business enterprises as well.
Absolutely. And number four on this trend list is actually those API integrations and utilizing it for businesses so they can not only offer that to their customers as far as a smooth customer experience, but also in integrating all of their different platforms that houses their back-end financials. So that's something that actually API management market is on course to hit 6.2 billion by 2024. And that's a huge number in thinking about how businesses kind of optimize their overall financial portfolio.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's a big market for sure.
Absolutely. And then when we talk about kind of the fintech immersion, one thing I found that was really interesting was actually higher education is now offering master's degrees in fintech and specialized degree type of programs. And I know you do a lot of speaking at college courses. And I wondered if that was ever something that you've encountered as kind of these new emerging technologies and the specialization of young talent in that pool.
I haven't, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. Obviously, it is being taught. I mean, I'd say the bigger trends we're seeing, or that I see on a personal level with universities, is more on the data science and AI side of things. That seems to be an area that a lot of students are studying. Having said that, usually it's IT or MIS instructors that invite me to speak in their courses, not so much on the finance side. So I imagine within financial majors or finance majors, I would imagine you're seeing more fintech discussions there, or at least they should be. And if you're a student taking courses in finance, you probably should take an elective on fintech or brush up on it just to be aware, because it is something, as we're discussing here, that's becoming very, very relevant in today's world.
Yeah, and something we also kind of talked about, or you talked about in your interview, is just the overall emergence of these new kind of startups within fintech and what that looks like. I know you talked about the risks kind of on the merger and acquisition side for businesses that are investing in third-party platforms as opposed to developing their own type of platform. So one that I found that was really interesting was, and I might say the name wrong, so just everyone bear with me, is Bankaya. It's a Mexican fintech that's going offline for customer acquisition. It's based in Mexico City, and it's a services startup that attributes its early traction to kind of going off of target consumers that are in person. So their CEO is local, and they just utilize offline channels to acquire different customers. And they have 50 million unbanked in Mexico, if you will. And they've been really successful in raising capital. And it kind of talked about how a lot of companies, bigger companies, US based or global, are looking to acquire them, and how they've kind of tried to keep that entrepreneurial model in place, and how long they can kind of sustain that. So it was kind of similar to what you were talking about as far as kind of that startup opportunity. It seems like this is kind of a niche area for that.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds like it for sure. And it's when Dan comes on the show later in my discussion with him, we'll talk about some of the different nooks and crannies and different niches within fintech. But it's fascinating to me how much is going on in the space because most of us or a lot of us know about Venmo and Apple Pay and sort of that consumer facing payment processing experience. But there's so much more to it, and that's really what I'm looking forward to digging into with Dan later in the show.
Absolutely, definitely. And I think it was really eye-opening to me throughout his interview of all the parallels that we've kind of featured in our 2022 trend content, and how that actually really is a legitimate initiative within the finance industry. And I honestly had no idea that that was going to be such a huge focus within fintech. I didn't even know fintech existed before this conversation. So I think there's a lot to learn from Dan, and I'm excited to kind of unpack that conversation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it will be good. I'm really excited for this conversation too because, like I said, it's one of my or some of my favorite guests are the ones where I know very little to nothing about the topic, and this is an example of one. Fintech is something I just don't know a lot about. I know fintech or financial technology in the context of bigger sort of enterprise-wide systems and deployments and more accounting-based stuff. But we'll get into with Dan is more focused on financial technology specifically for finance organizations, not just financial services or financial institutions, but finance functions within any organization as well. So if you're involved in any organization, especially on the finance or accounting side, this will be something that'll be very interesting to talk about. It's just interesting trends that we'll talk about here in a moment. So